Hello everybody, my name is William LaCourte Sosa. I'm a student here in Norwich completing my master's degree. And today I'm going to be talking about my capstone paper, Religious Voids, Radicalization and Social Imagination, a study on the appeals of Bolshevism. There are various reasons for studying this topic. Among them are the historical literature and its space available for it, and secondly, to understand people and how they developed in modern society. I'll explain more in the next slide, but just in case, generally speaking, it's about how very little historical literature discusses the Bolsheviks psychologically, and it serves a useful understanding for today's society, which is becoming ever more radicalized, especially in intellectual circles and the liberal arts and universities. So, to give you a more specific understanding of why this study is created, well, it's that most Russian revolution historians agree on many aspects of the revolution. Most agree that rapid social change in Russia, which happened 100 years before the revolution, created a space for it. Most agree that the Bolsheviks were better in using ideological tools in the pursuit of influence and control. And there is little debate on how the Bolsheviks and Soviets were able to establish and maintain their power and legitimacy in Russia. However, very little articles address the appeal of the Bolsheviks directly, beyond their use of force and the public policy they used and the historical happenstance which facilitated their rise. Psychohistorical analysis in this area of study provides a more nuanced reasons for not only their appeal and consequent rise to power, but also their ability to cement their position as the new leaders in Russia, and for their failure of the opponents they had. Ultimately, in hopes of producing a more holistic understanding and a more vivid picture of the revolution. Thus, given that there is very little historical literature which discusses the psychological appeal of the Bolsheviks, and it's a useful tool to explain not only their rise to power, but the way they controlled and cemented their cultural identity into Russia. That's the point of the essay. So, most studies used here do not contain any form of psychological data that we can have that is overt. Thus, we have to use psychological induction from the historical literature to make certain conclusions about the psychological nature of the event. About those authors that do deal psychologically with the topic at hand, we still have to make a systematic formulation from the data they provide, or the conclusions they provide, to make our own conclusions on the Bolshevism and the psychological appeal of it. Among these is J.L. Talman, The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy, and Fire in the Minds of Men by James Billington, which both describe the disillusionment of the West and certain cultural and religious and political voids that were created by or after the French Revolution. There's Charles Taylor and the social imagination concept that he creates, which explains how individuals begin accepting certain phenomena or ideas as generations go by. And then it's Carl Jung and Jordan Peterson, which are psychoanalysts, which serves to provide a third conclusion for the appeal of Bolshevism. Here are the findings in fine print, but just to go over them briefly with you. First, we found that Russians slowly came to accept revolution action as a legitimate tool to achieve political justice. This can be understood by Charles Taylor. Secondly, that Billington and Tillman write on the slow degradation of Western social values, religious values, and political values, and how eventually Russians had to find alternative solutions to these existential, theological, and political questions that they had, as all humans have. And finally, going in the same line of human nature, we have the Jungian psychoanalysts, which provide an understanding that human beings want to appreciate and promote certain systems which move them to be able to morally, quote unquote, produce evil actions or behave in certain manners which would then be shunned but now are applauded by. And such was this case with Bolshevism, which enabled many to do horrible things as most totalitarian systems do. Going into specifics, Charles Taylor, for example, writes that societies tend to take time to embrace new ideas, as is probably obvious to all of us here studying the history. But it's interesting to see how this social imagination manifested in Russia, specifically in terms of general people accepting revolutionary action as an acceptable form of political expression, which is arguably coming more present today, with protests being had outside Supreme Court judges' houses or city streets. And not to say that's revolutionary action or having a political opinion on the fact, just saying how you could explain that phenomenon with social imagination. Firstly, the process goes through an intellectual level where some intellectual authors, philosophers, writers, sociologists, whatever you may call them, start producing certain ideas which, generally speaking, are rejected by most normal people. Then certain pockets of the population, it may be radical soldiers, it may be young people, it may be students, start to appreciate the ideas of these scholars, yet are not completely adopted by the rest of society. You can find this today with, say, you have a daughter who goes to university and studying suddenly brings new ideas to your home. Perhaps those ideas are great, or perhaps they don't cohere with your worldview specifically. Whatever the case may be, it definitely is a way that ideas start flowing down into the lower echelons of society, and by that I mean non-academics. Then finally, eventually, normal people, children, the working class, adults, whatever social area or group of people, start adopting the ideas. In the case of Russia, we had the Decembrist Revolt of 1825, which, although being a totally failed revolutionary event, still showed the potential of revolution as a possible alternative to the political system. After that, we have the 1905 revolution, a revolt which was significantly more successful, yet still held the idea that, hey, now many of us can participate in this revolutionary action and actually achieve something. And once the president for social activity and revolutionary activity to be united by a larger percentage of the population, then in 1917 we have the full revolution, which many people from different parts of society participated. So much so that they created the civil war in Russia, which had people from all echelons of society fighting for what they believed in, or what their lord or lady or upper class member believed in, given the feudality of Russia. One of the primary sources you could use to understand this area of history better could be a New York Times article written in 1891 that preludes the 1905 revolution, called "The Famine in Russia, Little Sympathy Shown by St. Petersburg Rich Merchants." This can help you understand this period better, and it exemplifies some of the realities Russians saw in 1905, and how different groups in society began clashing and dividing in the already very divisive society that was revolutionary Russia. Billington and Taylor again talk about the religious disintegration, political disintegration, and social disintegration of the West after the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment saw the first true severing of a straightforward tradition in the West. There's obviously arguments that the Enlightenment was an expression of the Western thought, but at least in the local populace, it certainly was a sort of traumatic experience where suddenly people stopped believing in the millennial tradition that they had established in society. There were doubts concerning the religious foundations of society, God, and his role in society and morality. There was doubts concerning the way we know the epistemological tendencies of society. There was a flourishing of various alternative systems that were in place to replace the original system that we had, which is monarchic. So Billington and Taylor speak of these political voids and social voids, religious voids that were established after the Enlightenment, the French Revolution. In Russia, this process took a little more time. Western society had already rejected monarchy and started producing other alternative, more democratic systems, while Russia still had a feudal system, a Tsar system. Yet, it's useful to understand not only Russian society now, but Russian society in general, and how Bolshevism was specifically tailored for Russia in the sense that it imitated or emulated various older traditional systems. For example, Russia had a messianic vision of itself during the medieval history and early modern history of its existence. It considered itself an almost messianic nation, which was to carry the torch of Christianity, of orthodoxy, to the rest of the world. So too did communism state that Russia would be the first among many nations who would contain the light of equality and true freedom, or so they promised the people. So these types of religious tendencies were equally shared by the Tsar system and by Bolshevism. Bolshevism promoted an autocratic leader, the party leader, who was voted by, quote unquote, the party religious class, that is, those philosophers and sociologists and lawmakers that were constituting the true ideological body of socialism or communism in Russia. So this type of autocratically chosen leader emulated the Tsar, who was seen not only as the chief political figure of the society, but also as a chief religious figure, which embodied the ideal, or were supposed to embody the ideal of orthodoxy. Well, in this case, Lenin embodied, or could be expressed as the Tsar of communism. So Russians found a way to fill the older voids with more specific focus on their own traditional systems. So that's one of the reasons why Bolshevism was psychologically appealing to them. To add to the point on religious symbolism in communism in Russia, I'm going to read a passage out of a primary source called Appeal of the Main Cuban Black Sea Revolutionary Committee by Chairman Ostrobianco. And he states, "Fellow soldiers, a strong camaraderie discipline must be introduced into a revolutionary army, based not on fear but on conscious and understanding of the great and difficult role assigned to the revolutionary army. A revolutionary army can be strong only by cohesion, camaraderie, discipline, and a sense of duty. The main Cuban Black Sea Military Revolutionary Committee calls on fellow soldiers to be devoted to the great and holy cause of the struggle for freedom, equality, and fraternity. Victory Day is near, the hours of workers' liberation is near, the hour of triumph of people's power is near. All power to the working people. Long live the rule of the people. Long live socialism. Chairman Ostrobianco." A significant portion of the capsule investigation was based on certain psychoanalytical principles. The issue here lies then that in psychology there isn't a specific consensus on whether or not a specific theory should be prevalent over others. Nevertheless, it's important to take these as axioms to understand a significant portion of the essay, which is based on the justification of human nature and understanding history through it, by using psychoanalytical principles established by Jung and other, generally speaking, Jungian psychoanalysts like Jordan Peterson, which have become somewhat famous in these past years among specific psychologically interested youths. There are three significant archetypes or psychological images that all humans share and are crucial to understand the collective unconscious in general. There's the persona, which is the type of social mask that people wear for every type of social interaction. These are normal and necessary. Using me as an example, I'm a teacher, so the face I wear as a teacher can be exactly the same face I wear, so to speak, as I am William the son, or William the teacher, or William the... you get the idea. There's also the anima and animus, which is the type of self-knowledge that one creates when noticing the other gender, and how we can integrate aspects of the other gender into our own lives to achieve full individualization. This is a little more complex, and we don't have enough time to get into what individualization means by Jung, but it's still important to understand this area of study to further delve into the collective unconscious. And finally, and most importantly, there is the shadow, which is a type of id system in our minds that pushes us for more malevolent type of behaviors. These three archetypes can act cohesively and to make human beings better or worse in identifying them and understanding them. The unidentified life in this case could lead to human beings being possessed by the worst aspects of these types of social and individual dynamics. So, Jung comments on the collective unconscious in a relation to Germany before World War II, which one can see almost as prophetic given the actions they committed after the writing of this paper. The collective unconscious is you could argue it's like a web of ideas that we inherit through our society, mixed with our own ape-like mind that's within all of us. All societies have an all-father or a sort of hero aid that help us grow through our individual struggles. Wotan, on the other hand, the god of thunder, the German pagan god of war, thunder, and chaos, stands as an example of the collective unconscious turned uncontrollable. Given that the collective unconscious can turn into the worst of human beings, a world where people are unable to grow out of their masks, of their persona, a world where people are controlled by their shadow and their deep desires, a world where people cannot understand the other and instead turn inward into their own misshapen and uncontrollable worlds. So what does Wotan grow in society as the dominant god which moves all individuals towards certain actions? The All-Father myth, in our case it's Christ, and in Russia's case Christ as well, was disillusioned during the Enlightenment, and thus, instead of having a hero aid myth which would call us beyond our darker unconscious, we now have nobody to withhold Wotan, so to speak, and to control us and protect us from the collective unconscious. So, as society develops in the 20th century, after the French Revolution, specifically in Russia, which happened later than other Western nations, there was no mythological structure which could detain Russians from for the uncontrollability of their collective unconscious. Using the shadow as an example, the Soviet system and the Bolshevik system promoted actions which would have been completely unacceptable in a Tsarist system or in a Christian system, at least in theory, but were now perfectly acceptable in society. You weren't punished by hunting or detaining somebody because of their own loyalty to the state or their treachery to the party. You were congratulated by the party on your duty and the small atrocity you committed. So Russians, in their struggle to find, in their desire to promote more darker unconscious collective mentalities and desires, they fell into a system which promoted this type of dark, uncontrolled unconscious. Even though this doesn't technically count as a primary source, Robert H. McDowell wrote an essay called Russian Revolution and Civil War in the Caucasus. He actually lived in revolutionary Russia, so his voice is somewhat unique in that he actually experienced the revolution firsthand. He would comment on the very many types of atrocities that became ever more so common as the war raged on. And it's a perfect example to see how this collective unconscious can get unleashed in society, and it can get continuously worse as there's no psychological and spiritual limit to the type of impulses that revolutionary environments create, specifically communism, which promoted certain actions above all that could be seen as malevolent. So, why does it all matter? Well, each of these authors provide a specific view and understanding through which we can now understand our own position as modern people. as society grows more and more advanced, people get disillusioned in other ways which were not part of the Enlightenment and its own disillusioned. Western people now feel more lonely than ever, are more disillusioned with their system than ever. They participate more in radical movements, in protest, uh, and in activities which might not conduce to the best social cohesion ever. So it's important to learn from the errors that happened in Russia in the 20th century, so we can now understand and prevent errors from happening in our own 21st century. Beyond this, it's interesting to understand the intellectual and development of these types of ideologies. So when a new ideology like this comes, people can handle it, whether or not its morality is correct or incorrect, or its viability is viable or inviable. It's still useful to understand and see it as a phenomenon to study, not as some sort of supreme idea which flows and contaminates other people, for better or for worse. So this is a useful study to understand how people and society are developing currently and how they might develop in the future, as happened in Russia and has happened generally in other nations, which were not included in this essay for brevity.